بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. المحاضرة اليوم في مادة General Anatomy هي the one important structure that related to the face is the eye. Even though the eye is small, only about 1 inch in diameter, it serves as a very important function. Its vision is regularly the most used for 5 senses. We have 5 senses. One of the important sense is the vision, how a person can see through the eye. The eye is often compared to camera. Each gathers light and then transforms the light into a picture. Both also have lenses to focus the incoming light. A camera uses the film to create a picture, whereas the eye uses a specialized layer of cells called a retina to produce an image. So, when compared between the camera and the eye, that there are source of light, and that light can enter through the opening that call it the lens in both the camera and the eye, and this light can go to the film in the camera that forming a picture as an image, and the light that enter to the retina that forming an image to the through processing within the brain. The skeleton of the eye, the orbital cavity, has the roof, floor, and medial wall and lateral wall. The roof of the orbital cavity forms two bones. The majority of anterior part is the orbital surface of frontal bone. I'll call it horizontal surface of frontal bone. And small posterior bone related to sphenoid bone is the orbital surface of laser wing of sphenoid bone. And we have foramen that between the roof and the medial wall, the lateral wall is the optic canal, or call it optic foramen. The floor of the orbital cavity, we have the two bones. The anterior, medially, and posterior side of the floor of the orbit is orbital surface of maxilla, and the anterior and lateral side is the zygomatic bone. Where the medial wall of the orbital cavity from anterior to posterior, we have these bones. The first two bones, two processes, the frontal process of maxilla and the maxillary process of frontal bone that forming the medial edge, and then the lacrimal bone, and then the orbital plate of ethmoidal bone that form the medial wall. Within the lacrimal bone, we have fossa for lacrimal sac and nasolacrimal duct that go to the nose. The lateral surface of the orbital cavity is formed from anterior to posterior. The first the orbital surface of the zygomatic bone and the zygomatic process of the frontal bone that forming the lateral wall, and then the orbital surface of a greater wing of sphenoid bone. We have between the greater wing of sphenoid bone and the lesser wing of sphenoid bone and the maxillary bone, there are the fissure called it supraorbital fissure, and between the orbital surface of palatine bone and the infraorbital surface of maxilla and the orbital surface of the zygomatic bone, the other fissure called infraorbital fissure. From infraorbital fissure within the orbital surface of maxilla, we have infraorbital groove, and then infraorbital canal, and then go to infraorbital foramen. This is the skeleton of the orbital cavity. The structure of the eye from outside to inside. The first outside is eyelid and eyelashes. The eyelid that have two mobile structure, the superior eyelid and inferior eyelid that close the orbits. The eyelids serve to protect the eye from foreign matters such as dust, dirt, and other debris, as well as bright light that may damage the eye. And the eyelid also helps spread tear over the surface of eye, keeping eye moist and comfortable. This is the structure of eyelid from outside to inside. From outside the skin, it is thin part of the skin layer in the body, and then the muscles, and then the connective tissue, and then the mucous membrane that contain the glands within the mucous membrane. And at the free end of the upper lower eyelid, we have hair, called it eyelash. This eyelash that filtrate the air that enter to the and remove the foreign particle from the ear that enter to the eye. The eyelash help filter out foreign material, including dust and debris, and prevent it from getting into the eye. And beyond the eyelid, we have a structure called it a conjunctiva. The conjunctiva, as you see in this, is a thin, clear layer of skin covering the front of the eye, including the sclera and the inside of eyelid. The conjunctiva keeps bacteria and foreign material from getting beyond the eye, prevent any entering of microorganisms or any microstructure that enter to the eye wall. Beyond the conjunctiva, we have other structure called it sclera. The sclera is tough, leather-like tissue, also extend around the eye, just like eggshells surrounding an egg, and give an egg its shape. The sclera surround the eye and give the eye its shape. The sclera is also attached to extraocular muscle, which in turn move the eye left and right, up and down and diagonally. Real the sclera that form the outer layer of a wall, like the shells of the egg. It is حقيقة تعطي الشكل الكروي للعين هي السكليرا. And beyond the sclera, from anteriorly, there are cornea. Cornea is clear layer at the front and center of eye. In fact, the cornea is so clear that you may not even realize it is there. The cornea is located just in front of the iris, which is the colored part of your eye. The main purpose of the cornea is to help focus light as enter the eye. The cornea is the clear, round, dome-shaped membrane on the surface of your eye that normally about 0.5 mm thickened or 0.002 inches. Dim is about 1.0 thick. The contact lens rests on the cornea. حقيقة الكورنيا هي color no have any color within it is translucent. So we can enter the light through it without any problem, and can focus this light within the pupil and to the lens to be more clear picture. When take a cross section of cornea, should give a circle, but certain conditions that have not have a circle in its shape. It is round in a cross section of the cornea. In certain conditions, such as astigmatism, a corneal cross section looks slightly football shaped. It is American football, not an ordinary football. حقيقة كرة القدم الأمريكية كرة تتميز بالاستطالة، فإذا أصبحت استطالة بالكورنيا فحالة تسمى astigmatism. عندنا two conditions called it nearsightedness and farsightness. Nearsightedness is myopia. Farsightedness is hyperopia. Are also sometimes due to an abnormal shape to the cornea, although they are more often caused by abnormality large myopia or abnormal small hyperopia, the shape to enter the eyeball. حقيقة الكورنيا هي تركز الضوء الصورة على الرتنا، وأن تكون الصورة أقرب من الرتنا call it myopia، وأن الصورة تبتعد عن الرتنا call it hyperopia. لهذا عندما يصير قصر نظر أو بعد نظر تعتمد على شكل الكورنيا and the concentrated of light to the retina. Below the cornea, behind it, we have anterior chamber. The anterior chamber is the fluid filled space immediately behind the cornea and in front of iris. The fluid that fills this chamber is called the aqueous humor. The aqueous humor helps to nourish the cornea and the lens. حقيقة لا يوجد أي blood supply to the cornea and lens. فقط التغذية تعتمد على الأكويوس humor. هذا السائل هو يغذي lens and the cornea. This is the anterior chamber. And then the iris and pupil. The iris, which is colored part of your eye, controls the amount of light that enters the eye. The iris is a ring-shaped tissue with a central opening, which is called pupil. The iris is one part of layer which wraps itself around the inside of the eye called uvea. The part of uvea, including the iris ciliary body, is a tire-like structure just behind the root of the iris, and choroid is a layer located in between the sclera and the retina. This structure that have through the pupil or بؤبؤ العين المنطقة السوداء الذي من خلال يدخل light to the retina. The iris has a ring of muscle fiber around the pupil, which when contracted causes the pupil to contract, become smaller in the bright light. Another set of muscle fiber is radiated outward from your pupil, which causes the pupil to dilate, become larger in dim light or darkness. حقيقة يوجد smooth muscle around the pupil هذه ضمن the iris. حقيقة هذه في حالة يعني نوعين من المصل أن circular radiating. السيركولار هي لما تتخلص راح تصغر لنا من البؤبؤ في حالة البرايت لايت، والراديال ذات وين تتخلص راح توسع لنا البؤبؤ في حالة الداركنس or very light is dim light. The inflammation of the iris called it iritis, a painful condition characterized by sensitivity to light. The صار التهاب بالiris called it iritis, not increase redness around the outer ring of the iris. نلاحظ وجود احمرار في بياض العين ذات له علاقة بالايرس and inflammation, infection or inflammation of the iris. And other structure that surrounded the pupil and the iris called it anterior chamber angle and trabecular meshwork. The anterior chamber angle and the trabecular meshwork are located where the cornea meets the iris. The trabecular meshwork is important because it is the site where the aqueous humor drains out of the eye. If the aqueous humor cannot properly drain out of the eye, pressure can build up inside the eye, causing optic nerve damage and eventually vision loss, a condition known as glaucoma. حقيقة حالة التراخوما أو الجلوكوما هو عدم استطاعة العين إنه الأكويس هيومر إنه يخرج من العين. هذا إخراج this when the trabecular meshwork is closed by any material that have no opening for outside of the aqueous humor. فلهذا العين مهمة أنه تحافظ على كمية aqueous humor ثابتة، وإلا راح يزداد ضغط العين وتؤدي إلى العمى. هذا حالة تسمى glaucoma. And beyond the lens and the pupil, we have posterior chamber. The posterior chamber is a fluid-filled space immediately behind the iris but in front of lens. The fluid that fills this chamber is called the aqueous humor. The aqueous humor helps to nourish the cornea and the lens. حقيقة, this chamber that have located between the iris and the lens هذه أيضا فيها سائل يدعى aqueous humor for nourishment of the cornea and the lens. Beyond the posterior chamber, we have the lens, العدسة. العدسة is the lens is clear, flexible structure that's located just behind the iris and the pupil. A ring of muscular tissue called ciliary body surrounding the lens. Together, the lens and the ciliary body help control fine focusing of light as it passes through the eye. When the lens is cloudy or opaque, it's called cataract. حقيقة العدسة هي شفافة، وهي تستطيع أن تضع الصورة حجمها الطبيعي عند الرتين من خلال تقلص وانبساط العضلات التي تدعى ciliary body. هذه ciliary body smooth muscle that surrounding the lens if contract or relax that have the picture that is clear on the retina. في حالة أنه كانت اللينس بها cloudy or opacity, this is called cataract and the vision is reduced. And beyond the lens, we have a large cavity, called it vitreous cavity. The vitreous cavity is located beyond the lens and in front of retina. It's filled with gel-like fluid, called it the vitreous humor. The vitreous humor helps maintain the shape of the eye. حقيقة مثل البيضة الخلاف خارج الصلب في داخله سائل، هذا السائل يحافظ على شكل العين. So this is the vitreous humor is that help in the shape formation of the shape of the eye. And the last thing is the retina. The retina acts like film in a camera to create an image. To this, the retina specialized layer of cell convert light signal into nerve signal. After light signal are converted to nerve signal, the retina sends this signal to optic nerve, which carries the signal to the brain. There, the brain help process the image. حقيقة الرتنا هي مكان استلام اللايت، ويحلل من خلال خلايا خاصة بالرتنا، وتحول من اللايت سيجنال إلى الإلكتريكال سيجنال. هذه الإلكتريكال سيجنال travel through optic nerve to the brain and then processing of this image مثل المصور لما يعمل تحميل للفيلم ويستخرج الصورة، أيضا brain راح يكون processing of the image and the formation of image in the brain. The retina is primarily made of two distinct types of cells. We have rod and cone. حقيقة خلايا مسؤولة عن تحليل اللايت هو نوعين من الخلايا. أول نوع هو الروز والثاني نوع هو الكونز. أما اسطوانية أو مخروطية. The rods are more sensitive to light. therefore they allow you to see no in low light situation, but do not allow you to see the color. The cone, on the other hand, allow you to see color but require more light. حقيقة الرود فقط أن ترى الضوء، بس لون الضوء ما يقدر تحدده إلا من خلال الكونز. فهذا الضوء الخفيف كان يميز من خلال الرود، بس لون يحتاج إلى ضوء قوي لتمييز اللون. The one optic structure that is called macula. A macula is located in the central part of retina. It is area of retina that is responsible for giving you sharp central vision. The macula within the center of the retina. حقيقة تعطينا central vision، هو مركز الرؤية في الرتنا. The other layer of the eye that located between the sclera and the retina is called choroid. The choroid is layer of tissue that separate the retina and sclera. Is mostly made up of blood vessel. The choroid help nourish the retina. حقيقة الطبقة الثانية من الاي بول هي الكورويد، يبدي من الخارج the sclera, choroid and retina. الرتنا تعطي nourishment لأنه vascular and high blood supply, so the vascularity of retina and its nourishment by the choroid layer. We have a group of muscle that movement of the eyeball, call it extraocular muscles. There are 6 extraocular muscles are attached to each eye to help move the eye left and right, up and down, and diagonally. This is the skeletal muscle of the eye. The extrinsic muscle of eye are 6 in number, attached to eyeball. We have superior, inferior, medial, and lateral rectus muscle, and superior and inferior oblique muscle. This group of muscle, we have 4 recti and 2 oblique muscle. The 4 recti, one located superiorly and other inferiorly, and other medial and other lateral, and 2 oblique, one superiorly and other inferiorly. And we have levator palpebral superioris not attached to eyeball, but effect on the movement of the eyeball. There are common tendinous ring from which 4 recti muscle arise. It's attached medially and superiorly to sphenoid bone above optic foramen, laterally and inferiorly to small tubercle on a greater wing of sphenoid bone on inferior margin of superior orbital fissure. This tendinous ring حقيقة موجودة في نهاية الأوربيتال cavity. هذه هي the origin of the 4 recti muscle. The first muscle called superior rectus muscle. Its origin arises from upper part of common tendinous ring, passes forward and laterally below levator palpebral superioris. If we can see this cross section, the superior rectus muscle is below the levator palpebral superioris muscle. Its origin from the tendinous ring and its insertion with the sclera of the upper part of the eyeball. The second one is inferior rectus muscles. Arise from common tendinous ring below optic foramen, pass forward and laterally on the floor of the orbit. هذه inferior rectus muscle is below above the floor of the orbit. This is origin from the common tendinous ring and insertion in the lower part of the eyeball in the sclera. We have middle rectus muscle. Is the largest of ocular muscles, arise from the common tendon ring, passes forward and medially below the superior oblique muscle. حقيقة هذه المصل هو يكون in medial surface of the orbital cavity. Its origin from the common tendinous and insertion medial side of the eyeball in the sclera. And the last one, lateral rectus muscle, arises from common tendinous ring, passes forward and laterally. حقيقة, in lateral rectus muscle, its location in the lateral side of the orbit, its origin from the common tendinous and insertion in lateral side of the eye wall and the sclera. And we have two muscles, is oblique muscle, superior and inferior oblique muscle. The superior oblique muscle arises from area above and medial to optic foramen by narrow tendon. This muscle passes forward at a junction of the roof and medial wall of the orbit to the trochlear pulli, where it again becomes tendinous. The tendon passes around the pulli backward and laterally below the superior rectus muscle. حقيقة, the superior oblique muscle is a muscle that its origin from tendon above the optic foramen. هذه تكون between the roof and medial wall of the orbital cavity. تصل إلى anterior side of the orbital cavity at the medial junction between the roof and the medial wall. We have a trochlear pulli. Is tendon is a ring in shape. That this tendon of the superior oblique muscle come and go through this pulli and go backward and insertion within sclera below the superior rectus muscle. The last extraocular muscle and the second one of oblique muscle is inferior oblique muscle. Arises from maxilla lateral to the opening of nasolacrimal canal. The fiber pass backward and laterally and its insertion within the sclera. حقيقة, inferior oblique muscle its origin from the maxilla below the opening of nasolacrimal canal. حقيقة الموجودة in the around the nasolacrimal canal محاطة بالlacrimal bone, except the inferior part is from maxillary bone. So this origin from maxillary bone. It's go backward and laterally and its insertion within the sclera at lateral side of eyeball. We have other muscle not related to the recti muscle or oblique muscle, called it levator palpebrae superioris, arise from under surface of lesser wing oceanoid bone in front of optic foramen and inserted to orbicularis oculi muscle, upper eyelid, medial and lateral palpebral ligament. حقيقة, levator palpebrae superioris is an extraocular muscle that have its origin from the inner surface of the lesser wing oceanoid bone and go anterior in front of optic foramen. Its origin insertion in the orbicularis muscle oculi in the upper eyelid and medial and lateral palpebral ligament that have insertion of levator palpebrae superioris. The innervation of this extraocular muscle, we have motor nerve supply. The levator palpebrae superioris and superior rectus muscle by superior division of the third cranial nerve. There is the nerve that supply the majority of the muscle, extraocular muscle. The medial and inferior rectus muscle and inferior oblique muscle, it is from inferior division of the third cranial nerve. So the third cranial nerve that supply the superior and middle and inferior rectus muscle and the levator palpebrae superioris and inferior oblique muscle, that from the superior division and inferior division of third cranial nerve. The superior oblique muscle is innervation for fourth cranial nerve, which contain also postganglionic sympathetic, which come from the internal carotid plexus, and proprioceptive belong to fifth cranial nerve. Superior oblique muscle only is innervated by fourth cranial nerve. Lateral rectus muscle is supplied by the sixth cranial nerve, which contains also the postganglionic sympathetic, will come from the internal carotid plexus, and proprioceptive belong to fifth cranial nerve. فإذا except the superior oblique muscle and lateral rectus muscle, all the muscle that have related to third cranial nerve, but the superior oblique muscle from the fourth cranial nerve and lateral rectus muscle from the sixth cranial nerve. The action of this extraocular muscle. The first, superior rectus, rotate the eyeball upward and medially. Inferior rectus, rotate the eyeball downward and medially. Medial rectus, rotate the eyeball medially. Lateral rectus, rotate the eyeball laterally. Superior oblique rectus, superior oblique muscle, rotate the eyeball downward and outward. Inferior oblique, rotate the eyeball upward and outward. في الحقيقة, the superior rectus and inferior rectus is opposite to the action of superior oblique and inferior oblique muscle. The general visual efferent, how can a patient vision through optic nerve? We have preganglionic parasympathetic nerve. This synapse in ciliary ganglion. Postganglionic parasympathetic supply the sphincter pupil circle fiber around the pupil to reduce their size, and ciliary muscle to adjust the lens for near object via short ciliary nerve. في حقيقة خلال preganglionic parasympathetic سيطر على smooth muscle that have surrounded the pupil and the ciliary muscle that have within the lens and that have formation and of the image in the central of retina. The general visual efferent also include postganglionic sympathetic, which come from internal carotid plexus to supply dilator pupil and the blood vessel of choroid and iris of eye via long ciliary nerve and smooth muscle of levator papulae superioris. The third also contains this the postganglionic sympathetic and of this nerve. The general somatic efferent fiber are proprioceptive from muscle that supply by third cranial nerve. This fiber belong to fifth cranial muscle nerve. We have the optic nerve, the second cranial nerve. It is specialized for vision. The optic nerve, a bundle of over 1 million nerve fiber, is responsible for the transmitting nerve signal from the eye to the brain. This nerve signal containing information on an image for processing by the brain. The front surface of the optic nerve, which is visible on retina, is called the optic disc. It is a blind spot, one per eye. It is filled with the head of optic nerve, which is just like a bundle of thread, 1.5 millimeter in diameter. When the pressure inside the eye rises glaucoma, this spot also happens to be weakest spot in the eye, so the optic nerve laterally is crushed and dies. The blood supply to the eyeball. Both the choroid and the retina are richly supplied with blood. All these vessels arise from ophthalmic artery. حقيقة الريتنا لأهميتها سبحان الله خلقها بالrich blood supply. We have two different vascular systems, the ciliary artery and the central retinal artery. It is both branch of ophthalmic artery. The branches of the ciliary artery. First, the posterior ciliary artery are the branch supplying the vascular tonic of the eyeball, or uvea, which form the iris, the ciliary body, and the choroid purpur of the posterior wall of the eyeball. This vascular system not only supplies the blood, is also essential for maintaining the intraocular pressure and the tension of eyeball. This is the first branch of ciliary artery, is the posterior ciliary. We have other branch called it long posterior ciliary artery. This artery penetrates the sclera near the exits of the optic nerve. One of them runs the temporal, the other on the nasal wall of the eyeball to ciliary body and to the iris. At the root of the iris, they form the greater arterial ciliary circle of the iris, from where basal radiated to lesser arterial circle of iris near the pupil. This is long posterior ciliary artery. Short posterior ciliary artery. This forms the vascular plexus of the choroid, which extends from the posterior wall of the eyeball to the ora serrata. The inner choroid layer consists of specially wide capillaries, the choroidocapillary layer, and the border on the pigmented epithelium of the retina, whereas the chorocapillary lamina is firmly attached to the pigmented epithelium. The outer aspect of the choroid is separated from the sclera by the perichoroidal space and thus can be spaced. This is the short posterior ciliary. And other branch of ciliary artery is anterior ciliary artery. This runs from rectus muscle to the sclera, where they branch in the epicleral tissue and in conjunctiva. In the conjunctiva, they form the marginal loops around the margin of the cornea, pairs the sclera at the posterior aspect of eyeball, and traverse the choroid to the ciliary body and base of iris. Also, the ciliary arteries enter the eyeball, and independently, the anastomosis connect extensively throughout the choroid and this space. This is the other branch of ciliary artery called anterior ciliary artery. Other arterial blood supply for the eye, the central artery, or called it central retinal artery, a branch from ophthalmic artery and enter the eyeball in contact with the optic nerve. This artery enters the optic nerve approximately 1 centimeter beneath the eyeball and extends in the middle of the nerve to the papilla of optic nerve. هذا حقيقة الشريان الوحيد اللي يدخل من ضمن تركيب العصب الرئيسي لجهاز العين. فلهذا أي دمج للآرتري هو يجب أن يكون دمج للأوبتيك نيرف. فلهذا يدخل من ضمن السنتر of the optic nerve. Their capillaries reach as far as the inner nuclear layer, as the central artery passes through the optic disc divided in superior and inferior branches, each of which then divided into temporal and nasal branches to serve the inner layer of the retina. The retinal vessel and artery. حقيقة retinal artery هو من الارتري هو ليس به anastomosis with the other side because there is an artery within the eyeball. The venous drainage. The veins unite form the four posterior ciliary vein or vertex vein, which oblique penetrate the sclera at the posterior wall of the eyeball. The venule unite form the ventral vein of the retina drain from the eyeball through the optic disc. حقيقة عندنا مجموعتين من الفين. المجموعة الأولى هو ciliary vein or call it vertex vein، والمجموعة الثانية central vein, central retinal vein with the central retinal artery that emerged from the optic disc. The branches of central retinal artery can be observed within the eyeball through an ophthalmoscopy. حقيقة طبيب العيون يستطيع أن يرى تفرعات central retinal artery من خلال ophthalmoscopy. The other structure within the orbital cavity, it is the lacrimal apparatus that contains the lacrimal gland, الغدة الدمعية. The lacrimal apparatus consists of lacrimal gland, which secrete lacrimal fluid as tear, and series of ducts that drain in the lacrimal fluid into nasal cavity. The lacrimal gland, which is about the size and shape of almond, have حباية اللوزة حجمها شكلها is located in the superlateral portion of the orbit above the lateral angle of eye. Is divided by tendon of the levator muscle of upper eyelid into orbital part and palpebral part. حقيقة lacrimal gland تنقسم إلى قسمين that is relation to the levator muscle, superior levator muscle that have the orbital part that inside the orbit and palpebral part the palpebral part of the eye orbital cavity. It is a compound tubuloacinar gland that secretes lacrimal fluid as a tear through several extraocular lacrimal ductlets into conjunctival sac formed of the upper eyelid. With each blink of the eyelid, lacrimal fluid is spread over the surface of the eye, much like a windshield wiper spread windshield washing fluid. The lacrimal fluid drains into two small openings called lacrimal puncta on both sides of the lacrimal canaliculi. From here, the lacrimal fluid drains through the superior and inferior lacrimal canaliculi into lacrimal sac, the tear sac, and continues through nasolacrimal duct as a tear duct to the inferior meatus of the nasal cavity. حقيقة الدرينج of the tear من lacrimal fluid من خلال الجلاند to the nasolacrimal duct اللي تسمى tear duct to the inferior meatus below the inferior conchi. The lacrimal fluid, or call it a tear, is a lubricating mucus which keeps the anterior aspect of eyeball continuously moist secretion that continues a bactericidal substance called lysosome. The lysosome reduces the likelihood of infections. Normally about 1 milliliter or lacrimal fluid is produced each day by the lacrimal gland of each eye. If irritating substance such as particle of sand or chemical foam or onions like make contact with the conjunctiva, the lacrimal gland secretes the greater volume. حقيقة lacrimal gland تفرز الدمع من خلال this gland and تجعل الطبقة الخارجية للعين رطبة، هذا تكون مستمرة بدون أي التهاب. في حالة أنه أي خدش للسطح الخارجي للعين راح تزداد إفرازات lacrimal gland. The extralacrimal fluid protects the eye by diluting the washing away by the irritating substance. في حال وجود أي مادة تخدش الطبقة الخارجية من العين فهذا راح تكون أكثر سائل من الطبيعي فيصير dilution that wash the irritant substance. Thank you for your listening to this lecture.